Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to talk about the Consumer Price Index. So in past videos we've talked about what inflation is and the effects of inflation, but now I want to turn to how do we actually measure inflation with a numerical value. And there's actually two different methods we can use here, and the first one we'll talk about here in this video. So the inflation rate is actually the number we're trying to calculate here, and it is a percent change, so we'll talk about how to do percent change later in the video, although we've done it before. And it's the percent change in the price level. So remember, the price level, think of that being on an elevator at a certain floor in a building, and if the elevator rises, that's a positive inflation rate. If the elevator falls, that's a negative inflation rate or a deflation rate, if you will, and prices by and large are falling. And so the trick is, how do we come up with a way to measure the price level? How do we decide what floor of the building we are on? And there are two different methods to do this. And the one we're going to look at in this video is the Consumer Price Index. So the CPI is a way to measure the price level using the value of a market basket of goods and services purchased by the typical consumer. And this is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. And so what they do is they do some research and they figure out what does the average consumer buy, and they use this to track inflation, right? So they look at that group of products and they track changes in the prices of those products over time, and they use that as a proxy to measure the price level and therefore inflation. And so, and there's a lot of technicalities here in terms of what gets put in that basket and how often that basket changes. It does not change that often, and especially not year to year. But it does over time change to reflect changes in what consumers are doing. But we'll talk about some of the issues with CPI later in the video. Now, in order to understand CPI, we do need to understand this idea of a base year. So a base year is a year in which a price index, like CPI, is first calculated and used as a point of comparison for other years. So basically, this is kind of like in science where we hold something constant. We need a point of comparison. We have to start somewhere, right? And so we compare the price level of every other year to this base year in terms of the calculations. And again, I think the best way to understand a base year is to apply it, which we're going to do in a second. But it's a very important concept. And the good news is your exam, your assessments, whatever, will always tell you what the base year is, so you don't have to somehow figure it out. So let's go ahead and start calculating CPI, because once we do that, we can find the percent change in CPI to get the inflation rate. So there's actually three steps. So the first one is we need to calculate the value of the market basket in each year using that year's prices and the base year's quantities. So what we can see here in the table, and I do apologize, it's a bit small, is we're going to say there are three goods in the basket. We have apples, bananas, and milk. And then we can see the quantities, 1, 2, and 1. And so we're going to assume those are the quantities bought in year 1, which is the base year. And so I've given you the per unit price in the base year, in year 2, and in year 3. And so the question is, okay, so how do we figure out the basket total? And what I tell my students is think of going to the store and picking up 1 unit of apples, 2 units of bananas, and 1 unit of milk. You go to check out at the register, and they give you your total. What would that total be? So the way to do this, I'll go, and if you want to pause the video and try to do it yourself and then see if you're right. So for year 1, actually let's change colors here just so it stands out a bit. So for year 1, what we would do is we would say, okay, I have 1 unit of apples, so that's 2 times 1. Plus, I have 2 units of bananas, and they're each costing me 25 cents. Again, this is in the base year. And then we have 1 1 milk, and it costs $2.50. And so if I add all that together, it would equal $5. And so we could go ahead and fill $5 into the table, if you like. So year 1's basket total is $5. $2 plus $2.50 plus 50 cents. And so if we did this in year 2 and year 3, I'm not going to take the time to go ahead and calculate that out, but I will give you the numbers. Year 2 would have been $5.50, and then in year 3, the cost of the market basket would have been $6.75. So again, feel free to pause the video and just make sure we understand how I got those 3 numbers. Because again, every step is going to build off the previous steps, and so we want to make sure we understand this, because CPI does tend to be something that students sometimes struggle with in terms of the calculations, a little math involved, nothing too complicated, but again, it's just about getting the process. So that is the first step, getting the market basket totals. Now what we want to do is actually get the CPI in each year, and to do this we need a formula. And so here's the formula for CPI. So if I wanted to find the CPI in year X, let's say, I would take the price of the market basket, the total cost of the basket in that year, I would divide it by the cost of the basket in the base year, and then I'd multiply that result times 100. And so you can see now why the base year is so important, because we're always going to divide by its market basket cost. Okay, so in this case, we're always going to be dividing by 5, because on the previous step, we calculated the year 1 market basket cost as $5. So how would we do the math? So again, you can pause the video, figure out if you can do the CPI in year 1, 2, and 3, and then come back and see if you were correct. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So we'll do it in green this time. So for year 1, what we would do is we'd say, okay, what is the cost of the basket in the year I'm looking for, which is year 1, it's $5, divided by what is the cost of the market basket in the base year. Well, the base year is also year 1, so I'm dividing by $5, and then I multiply that result times 100. So this is equal to 1 times 100, which is equal to 100. And 2 notes here. The first one is CPI does not have any units. As you know, if you're taking this class with me, in person especially, I am a hawk when it comes to units. CPI does not have any, so you can just put the number 100. The other neat thing about CPI here with the base year is the base year's CPI will always be 100. Why? Because you're dividing basically itself by itself and then multiplying by 100. So the base year CPI is always 100. That's a really quick way to get that. Okay, so for year 2 and year 3, we actually have to do the work if we knew that little factoid about the base year. So for year 2, we take the cost of the basket in year 2, which was $5.50. We divide by the cost of the basket in the base year, which was $5. That was year 1. And then we multiply the result by 100. And when we do the math there, we get a CPI of 110. And then finally, for year 3, what we do is we take, okay, the cost of the market basket in year 3, which was $6.75. Let me just check to make sure that was correct. Yeah, $6.75. And we divide by the cost of the basket in the base year, which was $5. That was year 1's basket total. Year 1's the base year. Multiply that result times 100, and that gives us a CPI of 135. And so the question is like, well, what does that mean? Again, remember that basically these 3 numbers, 100, 110, 135, that is a measure of the price level. And what you could think of it as a floor number, right? You could think of it as, okay, in year 1, I'm on floor 100. In year 2, I'm on floor 110. In year 3, I'm on 135. So if I'm moving up floors, that's inflation. So if the CPI is getting bigger, there's inflation. If the CPI was getting smaller, there was deflation, right? And sometimes that can happen. You can go from a CPI of 100 to a CPI of 90. Deflation does occur, even though inflation is probably more common for what we're doing here. And then finally, step 3 is we need to find the percent change in CPI in order to get the inflation rate. So let's go ahead and do that from years 1 to 2, and then from years 2 to 3. So from year 1 to year 2, remember the percent change formula is new minus old divided by old times 100. So from year 1 to year 2, I take my new CPI, which would be the year 2 CPI. So I'll go ahead and put year 1 to 2 inflation rate, IR. And so that's going to equal 110, which is the CPI in the newest year, which would be year 2, minus the CPI in the year I'm leaving, which is 100. Divide that by the CPI in the old year, once again, which is 100. And then I multiply the result times 100, and so I get a inflation rate of 10%. So prices, generally speaking, increase by 10% from year 1 to year 2. And then I'll do the same thing for year 2 to year 3. So I would take 135, which is the CPI in year 3, minus the CPI in year 2, which is 110, divide by the CPI in year 2, which was 110, multiply that by 100, and the result you get this time, I believe, is a decimal, so I just rounded to a whole number, so 23%. I will tell you, if you're like freaking out or wondering, oh my gosh, on the AP exam, like what about the math? The math will always be very, very simple because you can't use a calculator. So you don't need to worry about having to do some kind of weird math in your head. It will look a lot like what we did here in years 1 to 2, where you could just cancel out the 100s and just do 110 minus 100. So nothing too crazy. And so that's how you get inflation using CPI. And so the last thing I want to do in this video is just talk about some of the problems with using CPI to measure the inflation rate. And there are actually 3 different problems. The first one is substitution bias. So CPI doesn't take into account consumers switching to cheaper products. So for example, like if the CPI has in it that people buy Dasani water, and then let's say Dasani water becomes more expensive and they switch to Aquafina water, that may not be reflected in the CPI. Like the BLS may not swap out Dasani water for Aquafina, and so the CPI may overstate inflation by keeping more expensive products in the market basket, even though consumers have been buying something different for some time. It also doesn't really include the newest products. So it took a long time for the CPI to include a smartphone, even though people have been using smartphones for several years. And so therefore the CPI reflects changes in prices, but not necessarily consumer choices. And then finally, CPI ignores improvements and decline in product quality. So while CPI may reflect stable prices, it ignores improvements to standard. And I'm sorry, my water bottle keeps like you're hearing like a popping sound in the background. That's my water bottle. CPI may reflect stable prices, but ignores improvements to the standard of living. It ignores, quality of life improvements, right? If people are, instead of using, a landline phone, people are using a smartphone, that should be in there. But the CPI is slow to adjust to those types of things, which makes it an imperfect but useful measure of inflation. So that's all for this video on the Consumer Price Index. Until next time, have a great day.